Welcome to The Explainer. I am so pumped to unpack this one with you today because it connects massive, high-level macroeconomic data directly to something deeply personal, the fundamental human need for a productive, meaningful job. Today, we're digging into the World Bank's Business Ready 2025 report, and it reveals a fascinating and frankly pretty alarming paradox about global employment. See, a thriving economy isn't just about abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about creating an environment where private businesses can actually launch, grow, and hire folks. But right now, we are staring down a massive global demographic shift, and the countries that most desperately need to create jobs are the ones least prepared to do so.
Okay, let's just dive right into it. 1.2 billion. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the massive wave of young people expected to join the global labor force over the next decade. We're talking about 1.2 billion young minds completely eager to work, earn a living, and contribute. But here's the massive friction point. They are entering this workforce against a backdrop of incredibly sluggish economic growth. For 2025, global GDP growth is projected at a mere 2.3%. That's lower than last year, and it's lower than the entire decade before the pandemic. So we've got a soaring supply of eager workers, but a highly constrained demand for their labor.
So the big question we've got to ask ourselves is, can this massive demographic vulnerability actually be turned into an opportunity? Because if you have millions of young people without jobs, you're risking a brutal, vicious cycle of unemployment, wasted potential, and economic stagnation. But, on the flip side, if a government can create a favorable business environment, one that really lets the private sector loose, demand for workers shoots up. Those young people find productive jobs, and suddenly, boom, you've ignited a virtuous cycle of economic growth. That youth boom literally becomes your greatest asset.
To really grasp where this pressure is boiling over, imagine dividing the global economy into three demographic buckets. First, you've got mature economies, which are actually facing shrinking, aging populations. Then you have peak economies, sitting right in the middle. But the real pressure cooker, that's the young workforce economies, where over 31% of the population is under the age of 15. The absolute urgency to create entirely new jobs is intensely concentrated right there in that first group.
And when we map out where this demographic pressure collides with economic reality, the danger zones become incredibly clear. The most vulnerable economies in the world right now are the ones that have an intense, immediate pressure to generate jobs, but score extremely low on business readiness. They are basically trapped in sluggish growth, and worse, they lack the supportive regulatory environments needed to break out of it.
Which brings us to the core paradox of this entire explainer. The countries that need jobs the most are the least business ready. Almost all economies in that young workforce group have business readiness scores well below the global median, with many of these located in sub-Saharan Africa. They face the most critical need for reform to handle this imminent surge of young workers, yet they consistently post the lowest scores when it comes to supporting private sector growth. It's like watching a tidal wave of eager workers crashing right into a brick wall of bureaucratic red tape.
So how do we actually measure this readiness? Well, the World Bank's framework looks at a business's journey through three specific pillars. Pillar 1 is the regulatory framework, basically the rules on paper. Pillar 2 is public services, the actual real-world infrastructure that governments provide. And Pillar 3 is operational efficiency, meaning how easy is it for a founder to actually comply with those rules without pulling their hair out in frustration.
When you look at global performance across these three pillars, a really striking story emerges. The regulatory framework, those rules on paper we just talked about, has the highest average score globally, sitting at over 66 points. But public services, that sits way down at an average of about 54 points. This tells us something absolutely crucial about how governments operate worldwide. It is infinitely easier to write good laws and copy international best practices on paper than it is to build the actual infrastructure and services needed to make those laws work for real-world businesses. And this creates a massive friction point. It's the classic battle between de jure, the rules on the books, and de facto, the reality on the ground. A country might have a fantastic labor law or brilliantly designed tax code, but if the online portal to register your business is constantly broken, or if the digital tax system simply doesn't exist, those laws are completely useless to an entrepreneur trying to start a company and hire local youth. This disconnect introduces our first major structural hurdle, the public services gap.
Now, what genuinely blew my mind in this data is the sheer size of that gap. Globally, there is a 12-point drop between a country's regulatory framework score and its public services score. That means across all regions and income levels, regulations are routinely rolled out without the necessary public services to actually support them. You can't just pass a law and expect the private sector to magically flourish. You have to invest in modernizing government services, building digital infrastructure, and making information easily accessible.
But hold on, because here is where it gets genuinely alarming. When we break that public services gap down by workforce age, the gap is nearly 3 times wider in young workforce economies compared to mature ones. Think about that for a second. The exact economies where millions of young people are desperate for jobs are the very same economies where bureaucratic hurdles and a lack of public services are stifling business creation the absolute most. It's this lack of practical support that's suffocating the private sector's ability to respond to the job crisis.
And that brings us perfectly to the second major roadblock standing in the way of global job creation, the efficiency gap. This measures the difference between the strength of the regulations on paper and the real-world operational efficiency businesses experience when trying to comply with them. Because even if the rules are good and the services exist, how long does it actually take to get a utility connected? How difficult is it to bid on a government contract? How reliable are the digital payment systems day to day?
As it turns out, low-growth economies, particularly those with young workforces, show the absolute lowest operational efficiency by a wide margin, scoring all the way down at 49. Firms in these low-growth environments face significantly more friction, bottlenecks, and barriers than their counterparts in high-growth settings. Essentially, this bureaucratic friction traps these economies in stagnation. It makes it incredibly difficult to kickstart the private sector development they desperately need to employ their youth.
So, how do governments actually fix this mess? Well, the framework demands holistic reform. It's not just about passing one magic law. It's about fixing inputs, like securing a physical location, opening up markets to ensure fair competition, and streamlining institutions so that paying taxes or resolving a business dispute doesn't drag on for years. Governments have to stop looking at regulations in isolation and start aggressively digitalizing services and removing these specific friction points.
So the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. We are standing at a historic demographic crossroads. 1.2 billion young people are ready to work. If governments can just close that public services gap and that efficiency gap, they can turn a massive demographic vulnerability into an engine for shared global prosperity. By empowering businesses with not just good rules, but actual, functional, efficient support, they can ignite a virtuous cycle where businesses innovate, the economy grows, and the youth finally find the productive jobs they deserve.
It is a monumental challenge for sure, but the data clearly spells out exactly where the roadblocks are. The only question left is whether policymakers will act in time to clear them. Which leaves me with a question for you to chew on. Is your local economy business ready for the next generation? Look at the businesses in your own community. Are the rules helping them grow, or is bureaucratic red tape holding back the jobs of tomorrow? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.